Fantastic. Great. So thank you for joining us here on the podcast for This Week in Christian History. We are focusing on February 21st for our deep dive for this episode, primarily on the day of the death of Chinese missionary Eric Liddell, who became famous for a bunch of circles, but one of them was his performance in the Olympics in 1924 and his very well publicized refusal to practice and to go to various heats and getting ready for the Olympics because they were taking place on a Sunday. And joining us is Professor Brian Stanley. Dr. Stanley is Professor Emeritus at the University of Edinburgh. He got his PhD at Cambridge, if I understand. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, right. And so your focus really has been on Western missionaries and really how they, these various missionary societies, right, and different groups that went out and did missions at places all around the world and kind of the interchanging dynamics of what that was like of missionary work, but yet being represented, let's just say, you were seen as very much British, so that made you maybe political when you didn't want to be political, right? Because of the people of let's just say, in China in the 1940s. So thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, missionaries couldn't escape being political, particularly at that time. For most of his time in China, Liddell lived in one of the so-called treaty ports, a series of ports which in the 19th century were imposed on China as areas of Western enclaves, Western control, where really the writ of a Chinese emperor didn't run. And that was a result of the Opium Wars, in which Western forces really blew the closed door of China open.
Right.
And those special treaty privileges lasted well into the 20th century. And when Liddell first went to China in the 1920s, he went to work in a missionary college called the Anglo-Chinese College in what's now Tianjin in those days. And it was very much a case of, yes, teaching in a missionary college, but spending most of his social life with Europeans, British and other Europeans and some Americans probably. It wasn't really the real China, but after a while he really got disillusioned with that, and he chose to go back to where he was born, in a much more rural part of China, where his parents were missionaries, where his brother was a missionary, and he really began to learn Chinese properly for the first time instead of teaching in English. Used to go out with a Chinese evangelist on his bicycle, preach the gospel in the villages, and he gained a real reputation among the villages, not so much probably because he was an Olympic gold medalist from the Paris Olympics in 1924, but partly because they knew that he was born there. They knew his father and his brother. Lineage is very important for Chinese people. And he became one of us, and very appreciated the simplicity with which he presented Christianity. Then that all came to an end when the Japanese invaded that part of northern China, and he had to go back initially for a while to Tianjin, and then he was interned in the largest of the Japanese internment camps in China during the Sino-Japanese War, and it was there that he died in 1945, on the date we're remembering today.
But now he died of a brain tumor, right? So it's not like
Correct.
we shouldn't be we shouldn't be thinking of, concentration camps per se, or any of these type. They were interred and put together and put in this, obviously in the camps, but it wasn't because necessarily of any type of persecution because of his faith or anything like that, of the reason that he died. Is that fair or not?
Yeah, I don't think the Christian faith was a major factor. All Europeans were interned as a result of the Japanese occupation of China. But the conditions were extremely very Spartan, very little food, very little warmth, little clothing. So although no doubt the brain tumor was growing even before he entered the camp, we don't know, and he didn't know that he had a brain tumor. I'm not sure he even knew, and at the end it was subsequently diagnosed. So the brain tumor itself was not the result of the concentration camp, which is what it was in effect. But if you have a brain tumor, the last place you want to be is in a concentration camp.
If you can't get coal and clothes, you're certainly not getting medical care, right? I mean,
Absolutely, yes.
So that would have been a factor on that. But so when he came to China after his time of his graduation from the University of Edinburgh, yes, and all of that, did he go back as under the London Missionary Society? Because that's who his parents were there under.
That's right. The same missionary society, which was primarily Congregationalist, although technically interdenominational. So it was very much in the family tradition. And he'd been to school at a mission school in the southeast of London, which was specifically founded for the sons of missionaries. So it was very much part of his genes, if you like, missionary service.
Well, how did those, just for our background, how did a lot of those societies, how were they funded? Were they all privately funded with donations and other people that just
oh yes,
put the funding in, right?
Yes, it was a massive philanthropic enterprise in the 19th and early 20th centuries. None of them received any state aid, except insofar as once they began major educational and medical ventures in the countries to which they went, there was a certain amount of state support, if there was a state, which often there wasn't. But the salaries of the missionaries, which were not princely, and their outfit and passage by sea were all paid for by the contributions of people in local churches. So missionaries were big stuff in the minds of the religious public at that time, and they probably gave more to overseas missions than almost any other cause.
Wow. But there were any number of these different societies,
yes,
operating at different times in different places with different, and some missionaries get more notoriety than others, but others would be just kind of what we might just call regular folks who felt called to be able to go and served in some particular spot and hunkered down.
That's right.
Right.
Many of them are not remembered. As we said at the beginning, Liddell is, I think, primarily remembered because he was a celebrated athlete, because of a remarkable story of the 1924 Olympics. And he was remembered as somebody who had given up a promising athletic career to go to the other side of the world with perhaps marginal chances of coming back, which proved the case. So it was a missionary hero sort of story, and there were a few biographies of him published soon after his death, particularly by a Scotsman called D.P. Thompson, who was an evangelist who had a great impact on Liddell and his Christian faith. And Thompson outlived Liddell and wrote the first biography of him. But relatively few biographies were published until the 1980s. Of course, 1981 saw the appearance of Chariots of Fire, which was an extraordinarily successful movie, not simply in Britain, but in the States. Within a year, I think it had grossed more than any other foreign film in the American box office. So it really put him at the forefront of the imagination. And then when we had the London Olympics in 2012, he was again sort of wheeled out, and there was a reissue of Chariots of Fire, and the melody from the Putnam film was played endlessly as part of a sort of introduction to the broadcasts. So all that helped to revive and expand his reputation, but very little attention was paid to his subsequent career as a missionary. There was a second film called On Wings of Eagles, which dealt with that, but I think it had relatively little commercial success.
Sure.
So it's a sign of how powerful the media can be in being quite picky in whom they select in terms of religion, particularly. And if a narrative of religion can be subsumed within a wider narrative of heroism, then that's good for the movie makers. And the same is true really even in China. You'll find that in that part of China, he is commemorated. There is a plaque, a memorial plaque in the former concentration camp, which was erected some while ago by the University of Edinburgh at the invitation of the Chinese authorities. There was no mention of him as a missionary. He is regarded as a symbol of Anglo-Chinese fraternal relationships, somebody who contributed to the good of humanity, and yes, who led an exemplary life, but virtually no mention of his Christian faith. That wasn't acceptable. So his surviving daughter, I think, has said that everybody wants their own bit of my dad. He's remembered in Scotland, particularly, as a sort of proto-Scottish nationalist almost. He's remembered in England. He's remembered in China. He's remembered in the States and Canada, where his wife and family were sent after the Japanese invasion. But everybody has their own little take on him. And all those takes are partial. They don't make up the whole man.
Interesting. Well, one of the things that on the Olympics themselves, help me keep the story straight, if you will. The heats that he decided not to participate in that were taking place on Sundays were his events that he excelled in. Is that right? And
yeah, he was a sprinter, really. And that was the 100 meters that he was selected for, and for which he looked like a dead cert gold medalist, but then discovered that the heats were scheduled on a Sunday and refused to run, and therefore withdrew, and instead ran in the 400 meters, which was not his distance at all. He'd rarely raced at that length.
But not scheduled on a Sunday, right?
No, not scheduled on a Sunday.
Because of that, it's not like he took up the javelin or he took up the
Oh no,
He took
no, no.
up some, he just switched his event. I mean, had it been the opposite way, right, that the
Mm.
400 would have been on a Sunday and the heats would have been right for the 100 on a Tuesday, we might not have even had the extra story other than, an Olympian that did well and won a gold medal, but we can't always remember every Olympian that won a gold medal either, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, I think he would still have been remembered, but it wouldn't have been seen as such an achievement or such a sacrifice if it had been the other way around. I think it was the fact that, a short distance sprinter takes on a whole lap race and, contrary to all expectations, wins.
but he was good. I mean, that's the other thing about it was it
Yeah.
wasn't like he didn't have the skills or he didn't have the talent or the ability or the work ethic to put in to be able to be an Olympian, right? So it's not like he just tripped into it or something.
Oh no, I mean he'd already represented Scotland at rugby football. So he was a born athlete.
Mm, no doubt about that. And then, but the local press, right, kind of bragging on the local guy, right? I mean, who did real
Mhm.
well was part of the thing that helped kind of build that up to even to talk about the fact that he was going from the 100 to the 400.
Yeah, I mean he
Built that
was
up over time, right?
greatly celebrated in Edinburgh because he was a student at Edinburgh University when he won that medal, and he at his graduation ceremony or on the day of his graduation ceremony, his fellow students sort of carried him in triumph through the streets of Edinburgh on a sort of chariot wearing an Olympic style wreath. So, and the vice chancellor, the one who was giving the award on behalf of the university, had this witty saying, Mr. Liddell, you have proved that none can pass you except the examiner. So, yeah, he passed his exams, but nobody else could pass him.
That was the only passing taking place, right? Was the
Yeah,
examiner
yeah.
who could pass on part of that. Hey, we're enjoying our conversation here for Christian history this week with Professor Brian Stanley, Professor Emeritus at the University of Edinburgh, speaking on and talking about Eric Liddell. Where did where is his medals? Do we know where they are? Does the family have them, or are they on display somewhere?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that they've survived. I've certainly never seen any reference to them. Yeah, they may possibly have done. I think, the youngest daughter is still alive, in Canada, Toronto, I think.
But did his wife remarry, or do you know, or did they
I
just?
don't think so. No. She was expecting their third daughter when she sailed from China to Canada. She was a Canadian, so she had family there anyway. She was the daughter of Canadian missionaries, so um, she was a missionary with the Canadian Presbyterians, and that was how they met.
But they kind of lived within this, and I'm going to use this term, kind of the bubble, if you will,
Absolutely,
of
yes.
these different societies that people kind of drew a circle and said, "Oh, we have some people that are here because they maybe are with the, foreign government, this or
Yeah,
some
I mean
that
it
or."
was a typical expatriate bubble. It wasn't just the missionaries. You were in with the bankers, the lawyers, the merchants. You had socialized at the local club. You you went to the European Bank. You went to a church which was very largely European or North American. Uh, so the contact with Chinese was really relatively little. I think that's what increasingly frustrated Liddell, why he felt I need to go back to what my parents were doing, to be out in the villages.
Yeah.
Now, the irony is that in the concentration camp, there were no Chinese. they were just Westerners. And there were a few local Chinese who went round the perimeter of the camp trying to sell vegetables and so on through the gaps in the fence. That was almost his entire contact with indigenous Chinese people in the last days of his life.
Wow. Well. How did his parents, was it his father, I would assume primarily was the one who kind of felt the call for foreign missions and or was there other people in his family that other siblings of his uncles or aunts or grandparents or anybody like that?
As far as I know, the parents were the first generation to serve overseas with the London Missionary Society, and then both of the boys followed suit. So yeah, it was a missionary, almost a missionary dynasty, but only 2 generations, really. Yeah.
Yeah. But that would be so he would you say that he didn't go there under like a Congregationalist banner, right? I mean, that was not really like that denomination sent him out to
Yeah.
do that. It was through the societies. He happened to be one, but those societies would have sent out a Presbyterian
Yes,
or
I
sent out
mean,
a Methodist or whatever.
it was technically a non-denominational society. It had what it called a fundamental principle, which was that we don't intend to impose any particular form of church order on our converts. Every group of converts should be free to make their own decisions
Ah,
uh, as to their church order, which sounds very progressive, but you can argue it actually made them Congregationalists by the back door, because you were saying each little congregation then has its own authority to do what it likes. In a sense, that is Congregationalism.
it's not like the Spanish in South America or something, right? I mean, where it was,
Well, yeah,
get right or you're gonna get right or you get the pistol, whichever one you want, right?
very different from a Catholic or Episcopalian approach to mission. Yeah. So, I
Mm.
mean, it was not very churchy. It was about the simple gospel. He was particularly passionate about the Sermon on the Mount, and the only 2 books he wrote were both really about the Sermon on the Mount. One was designed for the use of Sunday school teachers, and the other was a series of reflections on the Sermon on the Mount, inspired by an American Methodist missionary called Stanley Jones in India. So he was, I think, trying to live out simple, fairly non-dogmatic Christianity on the basis of the radical teachings of Jesus. That was his
Mm-hmm.
vision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which would get back to the sermon, right? Just turn the other
Yes,
cheek and
absolutely.
that type of thing that would have just said, hey, this is really like, love your enemies, right? Was probably a big one even in the concentration camp,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. And the Scottish nurse who looked after him in his last days in the concentration camp said about him, he was quiet. He lived his Christianity.
Mm.
So he believed that if you lived according to the principles of the Sermon on the Mount, people would be drawn to Christ simply through the power of that living. No, he wasn't afraid to proclaim the gospel at all, but he took seriously the evangelistic power of radical discipleship, I think, is what one would say.
Well, but it also seems like uh, 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 I'm forgetting his name that you just mentioned that wrote his biography, that the first biography.
Oh, D.P. Thompson,
Yes,
yeah.
he was the one, right? If I remember the story, that
Mm.
actually got Little to come and speak at some of his men's groups that he was trying.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
And
So he was an effective speaker, evangelistic speaker in men's meetings in Scotland. So it's not that he wasn't competent as a speaker. I think he was. but it tended to be a direct appeal, not heavily dogmatic or systematic in its theological presentation, but it was a presentation of Christ and the demands of Christ on everyone's life.
Almost kind of like a testimonial type of thing, maybe, where just, hey,
Yes.
tell you more about me and who I am and why it's important to me. Not so much, Spurgeon telling you you need to get right. It's not it wasn't anything like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have any notes of his addresses, so
Oh,
it's
really?
hard to know exactly what their content was. But that would be my guess. They would have been very powerful, but quite simple.
Yeah. Well, how did you get involved? How did you, whether you wish to or not, become the little scholar of really being able to focus on him?
Well, I'm not sure I would describe myself as a little scholar. I'm a
Okay.
historian of missions, and working in Edinburgh, one can hardly avoid the little the little story and its continuing resonance. I mean, only last year the university gave him an honorary doctorate, honorary posthumous doctorate.
Oh, really?
Interestingly, again, it said relatively little about his Christian faith and a lot about his sporting prowess.
Huh.
So the department which nominated him for the honorary doctorate was the physical education department of university.
Okay.
Not the theology and religious studies one.
Interesting.
Yeah, along with many other missionaries and different parts of the world that I study, Liddell featured, but I've never done a book on him or
Yeah.
anything really major.
Right. That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking time to be able to share with us some background on him, and it's interesting as well. I'd be interested to know what you've kind of seen, the impact that his story, maybe also with the movie, as a
Mhm.
as a that gave him this extra bump and thrust, if you will, towards the past couple of decades. They're like little societies and little groups and orphanages and other places all over the world, right? That are named in his honor. Is that part of what you think is maybe the permanent impact that he would have had?
Well, there are certain missionaries who sort of make it to celebrity status, and it's quite interesting to work out why that is in their cases and not in other cases. Some sort of heroic death is usually part of a narrative.
Interesting, yeah.
So somebody like David Livingstone dying in East Central Africa, apparently lost. He didn't think he was lost, but the rest of the world thought he was lost. After a lifetime of service devoted to combating slavery and spreading the gospel. And there are others who make the same sort of impact. You think of the American missionaries who died in Ecuador in 1956 in the Ecuadorian jungle, whose celebrity is intimately tied up with their deaths and the impact of their deaths. And in Liddell's case, he was famous before he went, just as an earlier generation of China missionaries called the Cambridge Seven, who went, C.T. Studd and others who went to China in 1885, who were, again, sports people, interestingly. Oarsmen in the University of Cambridge, rugby players, athletes. It was part of their impact in the university world, where here were those whose students really admired because of their athletic prowess, giving up everything to go to China. So there are certain factors like that that sort of build up your case for heroism.
Right. Right.
And, I'm not wanting to say they weren't heroic in the way they were, but, so were many others.
Right. 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 Well, it certainly gives us a great opportunity to be able to focus on something like this, to be able to think about this particular day, and particularly as it maybe other missionaries as well who went and did all these various things, and maybe one thumbs up for the unknowns, right? That don't get
Indeed.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, you won't get very far trying to make a film about the unknown. So,
But it seems like from the life that Little lived, he probably also would like to have celebrated the unknowns, right? Probably just as much as people who were the knowns.
oh yes, I'm sure that's right. Yeah,
Fantastic.
he was a very humble man. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stanley, for taking time with us today to
You're very
share
welcome.
part of your knowledge of this, and to take a moment out to hang out with us. We really appreciate it.
Okay, Nick.
Fantastic.
Good to be in touch, righto. Thanks for the invitation.